Now then, I'll introduce Ned Thomas to you in a minute. Diolch fawr iawn, Ned, am ddod ato ni. We have mentioned his name a few times over the past day or two. And you will recall that yesterday afternoon you were presenting your own language communities or so on through that lens of burning issues. Well, it's actually an idea that we stole from a book that we published in 1995.
Yes.
We had a conference called no, it wasn't. The conference wasn't called A Week in Europe.
No.
The conference was called something like Minority Language Media or something like that.
That's what it was called. Yeah.
And I remember it was a multi-site conference. We had part of it in Cardiff, and then we also had part of it in Lampeter. And then we had several prominent speakers. Marcello Otamendi was one of them. Vicent Pardal, whom we mentioned earlier as well, and he had just started the predecessor of VilaWeb, that was called Infopista at the time. So this was 1995, a long time ago. And then after that conference, we put together this edited volume, and the brief that we gave the journalists were exactly the same brief as you've had, which was, tell us something about your country, nation, region, whatever, through a news event that could be, a week, something that happens during that week. So we don't want it to be all about, oh, this is our language, spoken by 52%, no. So there's a range of different pieces in this collected volume. And then I'll just share a few with you. So what we had from the Basque Country was written by a journalist called Alberto Barandiaran, who worked for Egunkaria at the time. And he follows a murder case. It's not a politically motivated murder or anything, it's a murder case, and it exposes the role or the lack of role of the Basque language in the judiciary system in Spain. And so it's placing the language in its societal context there. We have something around the referendum to join the European Union from the Swedish in Finland at the time. So yes or no in Finland. And that's written by Dan Kronkvist. I don't know if this name is familiar to you at all, Jenny. And then I just choose one other one. And this is, what is it? Jan Sternkopf.
Yeah, it's one a while ago.
There you go. So, no longer on thin ice, identity through quality on the Danish-German border. And then, I can't remember what that one's about actually, if it's anything to do with global challenges or whether it's something that's specific to. Anyway, we need to reread some of these. So that's where the idea came from, that we would do something like this so that you would present your idea. And of course, Ned and I were working together, even in that period. And we've also mentioned the Mercator Media Forum. And we have some ideas around that for the future as well.
Yes.
Yes. So, we're going to see the film later this evening, and the film Asun. And the film, as we know, tells the story in a fictionalized context as well. It merges fiction and archive. And one of the stars of the archive section is Ned Thomas, who played a very prominent role in the campaign for Welsh language television for Esbydrec. So, Ned, as you featured in the film, but you were also living through that whole period and playing a very active part in it as well. We wanted to invite you to sort of as the warm up for the film.
Yeah.
But also we know of your great experience working in the field of minority languages, linguistic minorities, minoritized language communities, and all the different names and nomenclature and typologies that have been developed. Very strong role as well in the European Bureau for Lesser Used Languages when it was, as well as being, you know, one of the founders of the Mercator network and worked for so many years in that field too. I'm sure there are other things that we could point to in your career, but I think it's time for you to speak. So, croeso mawr, Ned. Diolch yn fawr iawn am ddod at.
Diolch yn fawr, Elin. Ga i ddweud wrth y Cymru byddai'n siŵr o ddweud rhai pethau ydych chi'n gwybod yn iawn, ond mae'n rhaid wneud hynny yn toes. So, I'm very pleased to join you, to know this course exists. And I know some of the places you come from, some better and some just slightly. And I was a journalist, a print journalist, when that meant rather different things from what it means today, for quite a lot of years. And so, if you think the 1990s were a long time ago, I'm going to talk mainly about the 1970s. Because the Welsh channel came into existence at the beginning of the 80s. So the film is to do with the last days of the campaign, and I will only say this much, that what carried the 10-year-long campaign over the threshold to reality in the end was the leader, the president of Plaid Cymru, the Nationalist Party, who had been a firm constitutionalist in his approach to politics, and who had been very severely criticised at various times for not taking a further step to sort of support direct action and so on, and who had been a pacifist all his life. He suddenly announced that he would starve himself to death if the government of Mrs. Thatcher, which had gone back on a manifesto commitment to institute a Welsh language channel, if they did not realise this. And that's the story of the film, and I'm going to try to bring you up to that point of view from the point that I entered the discussion, and that's why I say that it was really a 10-year campaign. And if what I'm going to give you is a personal account, and of course what personal accounts do, they have a sort of effect of dramatising things a bit, but their limitation perhaps, and this may be true of the film too, because it deals with the decision of one person, a very crucial person, that there is no scope in the same canvas to give the sort of wider context. So I'll try to give context while I tell my own story. The campaign was led throughout by the Welsh Language Society, Cymdeithas yr Iaith Cymraeg, and I shall call it Cymdeithas for the rest of this talk. It was an organisation of mainly, not exclusively, young people, and perhaps among the young people mainly, but not exclusively, students. And the campaign for a Welsh language channel, there were many other campaigns at the beginning of that period. The earliest campaigns were for official forms in Welsh to be able to deal with your income tax and so on. And more visibly, very visibly, the painting out of road signs, which were at that time exclusively in English, including many place names where there was an English form and a Welsh form. There was only the English form. So those were in 1970, let's say, those were the main projects of the Welsh Language Society. But as the discussion and the pressure for more Welsh programmes increased, and the realisation that television was now in everybody's house, speaking English mainly. There were a few hours of Welsh at late afternoon when nobody as much as watching television, and late at night. As the decade progressed, and this became, I would say, the kind of defining experience for many members, for most members of the Welsh Language Society, and beyond. Hundreds of people were taken to court for not paying the television licence. Smaller but substantial numbers of, again, mainly young people, many of them young women, went to prison for extended periods, and this became part of the social history, and for a lot of people part of their life experience. So that, for instance, some of the young women who went to prison, they wrote novels which were not really about the language any longer, but about, they were radicalized maybe as feminists, seeing who were the other women in prison. You got to know people they would never have met perhaps before. And so, and then many people were sent to prisons over the border in England where they were not allowed to receive correspondence in Welsh. And this led to further protests. And when people went to court, they refused to speak any language but Welsh. So this led to other protests. So what was the central and escalating conflict was over television, but it spilt over into the experience and the wider protest about the language, and into the life stories of so many people, of those student and young people in the 1970s. Over those 10 years, I was involved first as an observer, as a journalistic observer, then a supporter, then a specialist advisor, because I knew quite a lot about television for a reason I'll explain. And finally, as a fully fledged activist within the leadership of the organisation in its last year or two. The danger of personal account, as I said, is to leave out the wider context, but I ask you to bear all that complexity in mind as I select some glimpses from my own personal experience. I came back to Wales in 1969 after periods working abroad and years as a journalist in London. And I moved to Wales thinking I would write a novel and make sure that my children grew up speaking Welsh, which it was perhaps not likely to do in London in those days. I arrived at a turbulent time of protests, including the road signs protests, but others to do with the installation of the present King of England as Prince of Wales, which was used by the Secretary of State for Wales at the time, the Labour Party, as a kind of a way to resist to emphasise the Britishness of things in Wales. So instead of writing a novel, I wrote a rather impassioned book directed to English socialists, explaining the Welsh language, the case for the Welsh language. And I founded a magazine in English in Wales as a sort of forum to discuss our future between the various groups who were not really, had no real centre to discuss things seriously, and that was called Planet. I was trying to live as a freelance, and because of my earlier connections and employment, I had various columns I wrote in London papers, and one of these was a weekly column on television for my old employers, the Times Educational Supplement. Well, it was a serious paper, so you had to write not only about, the programme you saw last night, but about the discussion of the future of broadcasting. There were technological developments. VHF was moving to UHF, and so this would affect the transmitters and the coverage and so on. So it was the future of broadcasting generally in the UK was in the air, and would eventually lead to the idea of a fourth channel, the idea that perhaps the BBC had become too monopolistic. There was one commercial channel, but there was one general BBC channel and one minority channel, and now the suggestion was perhaps there should be a fourth channel, and the debate that developed over a channel for Welsh occurred in that context. And I found myself thinking, well, I'm discussing these things on the one hand in the British context, but what are the implications for Wales? So in the second number, dated 1970, I commissioned a symposium on broadcasting in Wales, and a face looks out from the screen saying, "Dyma," here is, "the news," so half in Welsh, half in English. And that, well, I was looking back over this, and all sorts of ideas were being thrown in, but of course there was no, and some of them are still relevant. Like people said, well, isn't it time that we have all these commissions about broadcasting in Britain, but couldn't we have a commission to look at broadcasting in Wales? And other people said, there's a need for a Wales Broadcasting Authority to sort out this linguistic questions and so on. And somebody to suggest perhaps have a separate channel, but nobody really knew how that was possible. And these were rather utopian ideas, but what is absolutely clear is that I had established figures there, the director of commercial channel, the ex-director of the BBC in Wales, and of course they argued for institutional positions, and then there were people who wanted to reform the system, and there were Welsh language activists who said, why can't we see our own language on the screen, except at these extraordinary times? So, but what everybody agrees about is that there should be more programmes in Welsh, but there should be more programmes in English from Wales, and there's no way you can increase the hours of Welsh programming without getting a very negative reaction from English speakers in Wales, because the Welsh hours, although they were at very unpopular times, they displaced English programs. So it was a major, everybody there says this is a source of conflict, and I was very aware of that because the conflict on language could run in families. For example, in families, people had lost the language, people had not, and so on. And I remember going into to buy a loaf in my local baker's in Aberystwyth, and in front of me, this was a time when the Welsh Language Society, Cymraeg, had turned off a transmitter and lost the programmes for a whole evening. And she was saying to the baker, she was saying, "Oh, my husband, you know, he lost his favourite programme and so on. He hates the Welsh language now, you know." And of course that could happen not because just when you switched it off, but because people's favourite programmes were switched off if they happened to be the opt-out time. So that's how things stood. And gradually, and I think with a bit of help from myself too, as I got closer to the society from being an observer, the idea that perhaps a separate channel was not technically or politically out of the question did gain traction. And I managed to get a very small sum of money from the Leverhulme Foundation to visit places, fairly small countries, where they had bilingual or multilingual broadcasting. And of course, there were no autonomous situations in Western Europe at the time that had that, but so I went to Switzerland just for about 3 days, and then Belgium. And I'm not sure really how much one could learn from this, except the very fact of making comparisons has always been a kind of something that minorities do. They say, look at over there, they can do it. What I remember feeling very strongly is it would be nice to do it in the Swiss way rather than the Belgian way, because the conflict had reached such heights in Belgium that they couldn't even share a transmitter to transmit two different things. Everything had to be completely separate. Whereas in Switzerland, the only people who lost out, I'm afraid, in television, well, they got some radio where the Romansh speakers, but in compensation for this, they ran the finance office because they were the only people who could be trusted by the other groups to be even-handed. So it wasn't a great contribution, but that was in Planet 3. So you can see that's the way things were moving. And this question of conflict, language conflict, which television was feeding, and which anybody who wanted to transcend that had to find ways of doing so. That remained, I think, throughout the decade as a major factor. The specialist commissions, which, like a lot of other people, I gave evidence to about Wales, they were not generally hostile to Welsh language. You know, they would typically have 1 out of 10 members chosen from Wales, and these would be people who were fairly established and were not going to take a very radical position, but they put the case. well, and others were invited to come and give evidence, and I did, as did many others. And that was not really the problem. These reports usually kept the door open for doing something for Welsh, but the moment you fed this into the political system, which required decisions, then Wales was always marginal, so marginal that you were not on the agenda. And this in turn, this feeling that the Commission had said yes, it would be possible to do this for Welsh and so on, but nothing happens. This fed the frustration, and the direct action campaigns they had their own dynamic. Now, part of the Welsh self-justification story is that the things we won by pacific means, unlike in some places. That's right. Yes, that's true. There were clandestine movements that went into areas more violent than the Welsh Language Society. But the Welsh Language Society defined itself as non-violent direct action. And the kind of heroes of the time were Martin Luther King, I was the generation of 1968. This was the kind of, in the north of Ireland, you had civil rights movement before it turned very nasty. And Ireland, the civil rights movement, racial overcome, it was, anti-Vietnam, all that fed into the and justified direct action in international terms, but it has its own dynamic, I think, direct action. The policy of Ned Thomas at the start was you take whatever action it is, let's say, you turn off a transmitter, you invade a studio, you wait for the police, they arrest you, you're taken to court, you go to court, you say, this is why we did it, we have a good case, find us not guilty, although of course we did it. And of course, most cases, people were sent to prison. One or two cases, the magistrate sympathised, and this really got the authorities quite worried. But as this became more common, you got less publicity. So after a while, transmitters were switched off clandestinely, and the actual people who did the job disappeared into the night, and these officers of the governing body of the Welsh Language Society said, we take collective responsibility, come and arrest us. So that was difficult because, of course, you couldn't. You had to show a connection between the intention, the declared intention, and so the only way was conspiracy trials. And so there were, I attended one conspiracy trial, and in the first trial, the jury, the Welsh jury, couldn't agree, although because they felt it was not enough to prove guilt, that people were saying, yes, we take responsibility for this. It couldn't be shown that they did it. And so they were not convicted, so there had to be a retrial, and the jury in the second trial, I was there with the professor of mathematics from Aberystwyth, And they read out the names of the jurors, and that was on the first day of the trial, and there was not a single Welsh-sounding name. And the professor of mathematics went home and looked at the telephone directory for that area and decided that the chances of finding at random, as you were supposed to do with juries, of finding 12 names that didn't include Evans, Thomas, Williams, Roberts, Jones, all the Welsh names, was 1 in a million or something. So obviously the jury was rigged, and then there were false arrests and people, and there were other protests by other bodies that went to do with broadcasting that sometimes claimed the attention. So there's an escalation in the direct action, but it remained within the bounds of non-violence, which was redefined, shall we say. There were tensions within the Welsh-speaking community, and of course, within minorities, when you have one campaign which is against the state, and then you have this infighting, it can get very heated, and in many ways more heated than the greater struggle. And the main opponents, as the prospect of a Welsh language television channel became more credible and gained more support, the main opponent, institutional opponent, was the commercial channel in Wales, which had a region. It was a region that included Wales with the west of England. So, you know, a television channel has quite a lot of patronage. It appoints people to various advisory posts. It had its spokespeople in the Welsh community, and some of whom had considerable status, and there were arguments, you know. So there were vested interests. The BBC itself was rather divided. But the commercial channel was strongly against. But there were one or two people who had arguments of principle which were worth considering, and one of these was that if you moved Welsh onto a single channel, it would cease to have, to the greater population that in Wales that didn't speak Welsh, they at least at the moment occasionally saw a Welsh programme, and this would be removed. And the Professor of Education here in Aberystwyth, who was a very committed man and very committed to Welsh language education and the extension of this in English-speaking areas, and gave his life and died on a train because he just couldn't stop working on this project. He said, well, no, you know, keep the Welsh language in front of the eyes of the non-Welsh speaking population. Now, this argument had some force, but it was very limited, and it really only had force in the most Welsh-speaking, westernmost areas of Wales, where the only transmitters were Welsh transmitters. But in the south, in South Wales, and in East Wales and North East Wales, where the bulk of the English-speaking population was, people had a choice. They could turn their aerials to aerials in England, and I stayed for a while in Monmouthshire, just north of Newport, and the whole housing estate that I was living in at the time had their aerials tuned to west to England. They didn't even see the Welsh weather. They saw the weather of Exeter and places like that. So we had to contend with this, and the leading Welsh weekly newspaper sided with that argument in the last year of the project. So by 1979, a lot had changed in the politics in Wales. The Labour government of the time, largely under the pressure of Scottish nationalism, decided it should offer a referendum in Wales on a very limited elected assembly for Wales. Half the Labour Party in Wales, and maybe more than half, really didn't like the idea at all. It was just a kind of idea dreamt up by the Labour Party in London because they had to offer Wales something because they were afraid they were going to lose a lot of ground in Scotland and so on. So there were arguments in the Welsh-speaking community, in the English-speaking community, and on March the 1st, the vote in this referendum was lost by a very substantial margin. So Wales voted against having any kind of devolution, and morale was really terribly low among people who were attached to the idea of Wales as a unit and so on. But worse was to come, because in the May general election to the Parliament in London, Mrs. Thatcher came to power with a kind of sweeping brief to take on the mining unions, which her predecessor, Labour and Conservative, had not done. So the steel industry in South Wales was decimated. Tens of thousands of people overnight were made unemployed, and what led to the long miners' strike of the early 80s was set in motion. But the Conservative Party had promised a Welsh language channel in their manifesto, and a few months, well, soon after Mrs. Thatcher came to power in May, the new government decided, after all, we will not concede this Welsh language channel. Instead, we will increase by a small number the hours on the existing channels. And this was the moment in which I was by now on the governing body of Cymraeg, and a number of older statesmen, if we can call ourselves that, had said in certain circumstances we would be willing to take some extra legal action. So they said, we think the time has come. So the following story tells you a lot about Wales, but it also omits other things. The two people, I was the youngest of the three, but I had attained a sort of, in a society that had quite a lot of respect for academics, and I'd reached kind of senior lecturer level, so it was thought to be, quite respectable. And then, but the two older people were much more respectable. I was really there because I'd taken a particular interest in broadcasting, But the eldest of us, I think it was the eldest, Penna Davis, was the principal, retired now, of a theological college. So, man of impeccable moral status, that he should break the law, And he did so on theological grounds, almost, that every nation in the sight of God has a right to its existence, or in modern conditions, you have to have that. Then there was Meredith Evans, who was well known to the wider public, because he was a folk singer, a collector of folk songs, a senior lecturer in philosophy, who for many years had been head of light entertainment in BBC Wales. So he was the most recognisable face and name, and I had began appearing as a journalist and so on, giving my views. I was also known on television, and so we said, well, we have to have somebody who knows how to break it to take us there. So we went on the night this was arranged, to Llanfair, about 30 miles from here, not too far from the Pencarreg transmitter. And we had a very nice afternoon tea in the house of a bank manager. We were in the front room, the best china, cakes, and so on. Every now and then, the son and daughter of the house, who were younger, the son was a student age, he and his friends were having something to eat in the kitchen, I think. And they put their faces in and said, you need to be ready in half an hour, So the Welsh Language Society in those days was a mixture of extremely astute leaders, with great political sense and so on, but also, at times, terrible kind of amateurism so my second cup of tea, I said, I suppose somebody has prepared in the office of Cymraeg a press notice about what we're going to do, so that this can be. So we phoned, and they said, oh, no one thought of that. So I scrawled kind of why we are telling this account, and we read it over the phone to them, so you had this mixture of sort of strategic people, really very good strategically, and then, because all sorts of volunteers were called into the office to do things and so on, and so we did that, and so off we went, and the set of cars, and they went to the top of the mountain, and it's a bit misty, and the students had wire cutters, and they were pretty professional. They opened the fence, and then they opened the door, and so then they said, all the best, off they went, and so in we went, and we were surrounded by this maze of switches, and we thought, which one switches off? So we tried this and that, and sometimes we just put the lights out. And then, but there was a steady hum from the transmitter. So in the end, we pulled the right switch, and the hum stopped. So then we were going to wait for the police, you see. So we waited and waited, and I was going to go to Florence, I remember, for a sort of sabbatical term, and so Helen Davis said, yes, if you go to Florence, this, you've got to do this and that, because, in the 15th century, you had Savonarola preaching on the square and so on, so we got into the politics of 15th century, Dante and so on and so on. And then suddenly a young policeman appeared, and he was a bit bemused and said, "What are you doing here?" And we said, "We've come to switch off the and he said, "Oh yes." "Oh," he said, "you're Meredith Evans too." And he said, and Meredith Evans had adjudicated in a local experiment. There's a competition held locally, and then there's a national, and he had given a prize to this policeman's small daughter. So they went off to talk about the Eisteddfod, and what Eisteddfod it was, and how, you know, and so on. So we said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And he said, "I have to speak over the sort of intercom." There were no mobile phones, but the police had something those days. So a more senior policeman came, and then he had to phone back, and then they said, "Well, would you mind coming with us to the police station in Lampeter?" And we did. And we had brought our pajamas, you know, ready to go to the cells. And then about 11 o'clock, they said, "Well, yes, you can go home now, but you'll be hearing from us." And it's a small country, Wales, and as you know from other small countries, you know, everybody knows everybody, really. Later the next day I was in the university here, in the English department where I taught, and I went to my first seminar, and there was one Welsh-speaking girl in the seminar, and she stayed on at the end, and she said, "We heard this on the news, you know, in the summer. You'll lose your job now, and what will you do?" And then I came out of the seminar, and my head of department said, "He was an Englishman, he was reasonably fair-minded towards Welsh, but he wasn't ready for this sort of thing in the department." So he said, I'm on my way to see the principal." By the time he came back, I had a note in my pigeonhole from the principal, who was a figure of what you might call the Welsh establishment. He had been the chief civil servant. He'd made a career in the British civil service. He'd ended up as the principal civil servant in the Welsh office, the Ministry for Wales. His note said, "I can well understand your motives. Don't worry, you know." He was the son of a miner. He had followed the arguments. You had support in the most unlikely places. So we then, the police could not decide what to charge us with. And this was a big mistake, because had they charged us, the rules for the press and so on would have prevented our talking about why we had done it. But they took nearly a year to charge us. So we became sort of heroes going around conferences and having, you know, people rising to their feet. So we got a lot of publicity out of it. But then we came to trial, and I don't deceive myself that the treatment we had from the police was typical, because the police everywhere, you know, they treat you better if you're middle class, have some status. I had students girl students who'd been pulled by their hair down the steps when protesting outside other trials, people who had suffered really quite badly. So it wasn't so cozy as the story I tell. But later that week, another cosy bit, I was on something called the Welsh Film Board, which was a small initiative. We had enough money to make, because Welsh television didn't make films, it had talking heads, and news and so on, but it didn't have. But the Welsh Film Board made one and sometimes two short films in a year. And who was on it, besides myself, but the head of BBC Wales and the head of ITV Wales, and we met in the country house east of here, Gruffydd. So I walked in, and there was Owen Edwards, whose transmitter whose programs I had turned off, and you know, we all shook hands, and here was so what is his name, Alan Vaughan, ITV, who was our great enemy, but as a person, you know, I rather liked him, and so we shook hands and so on, and so that's Wales. So, but when it came to trial, the judge decided to give us a hefty fine each rather than send us to prison, because not to make martyrs of us. So he gave us a largish fine each, and it was just before the Eisteddfod. So the bank manager who had hosted our tea, he said, well, I will establish a fund, and by the end of Eisteddfod week, we had more than enough money to pay all the fines, and we were able to pass money on for the next, to the next protest and the next set of fines. But I don't kid myself that really our event, it helped. It helped keep the atmosphere and the heat on, but it was Gwynfor Evans's decision, not so long after our trial in the late summer, autumn, to say that on such and such a date he would begin this fast unto death. And it took, I have to say, it took most people I knew and myself by surprise, because it was out of character, it seemed to me, and that I'm not going to prejudge anything that you had seen the film, but you know, you can discuss afterwards. People have discussed why he should have felt that he must do this, but that is what carried it over. And during those weeks, a small group of us decided that we were the best ones to sort of try to have an international campaign to get publicity beyond Britain for this, and we did with very limited success, I have to say. I think Le Monde is something, can't remember. But in that process of trying to do everything to lobby everybody possible, I did what probably, if I try to be objective about the whole thing, was probably my greatest contribution. I went back to my old employer, the Times. I knew the people who wrote the leading articles, and I could be pretty sure I knew who would get this job, because they specialised, roughly. And I was right. It's a man called Geoffrey Smith. I had worked with him. He'd trained me to a certain extent, because although I worked on the educational supplement, I reviewed novels for the Times, and I did things on Spain for the Times, so they knew me and I knew him, and he was a fair-minded man. I knew exactly how this was the Times before Rupert Murdoch took it over, and which was not long in coming. And I went, and as I went through the revolving doors of the Times building in London, who was coming out but the managing director of ITV Wales and West. And he, I could see, had been there lobbying against the Welsh Channel. So I went in and I said, you know, you've read the Commission's reports, you've seen the reaction in Wales, and Ireland, what was happening in Ireland was always in the background, and Mrs. Thatcher, you remember, was an attempt on her life. There's people who didn't want things to get out of hand and go in the Irish direction. You know, there were all these things in the surrounding environment. And yeah, Geoffrey Smith said, well, I've heard what you said, I'm still looking at all the cuttings and so on, as you did in those days. No online sources. You had card indexes, cuttings, everything that anyone had ever said in print and so on. And I went away feeling, well, you know, but what I feared was that as the Times had a habit of doing, you know, very probably he would say, well, on the one hand, there's a lot to be said for this, and on the other hand, you know, it's difficult and so on. I was afraid that, you know, but sure enough, the next day, the Times came out saying, considering the long history of this, considering the strength of feeling in Wales, considering the fact that we don't want, you know, this fairly justified claim to get attached to more radical anti-British and so on. We think the right thing to do would be, and within days it happened. So I'm now just going to look back very briefly, if I've got a few minutes, on the whole experience. At the height, you know, we had this slogan, Cymraeg, Cymraeg, the Welsh language channel, the only solution. And it became kind of messianic, you know, as if it was Jesus saves. This will be the solution to everything. And of course, you know, at the end of the day, it's only television, it's banal and so on, and it's Welsh television has its great moments and has its really bad moments. And it started off with very, as I had followed the whole thing, with a very generous grant, because all the time the opponents had been saying, but we can't have it because it would cost this, and then they would raise the price. So by the time they had the U-turn, they had tied themselves to more money than I had ever expected that we might get. But of course, ever since then, it's gone downhill. Looking at it now in the kind of wider international context, we were the first, just ahead of the Catalan and Basque channels by a matter of months, I think.
Yeah, I think just
maybe
just under 2 months in the case of the Basques.
Yes. So, but they established, as a result of having an autonomous government. So it was a policy decision, whereas in Wales it was a concession. And you might say, well, it doesn't matter how it comes about, you get it, and of course it was a great victory. But of course we live with the consequences of that, and that there's still no authority, when there's still no English language service for Wales, very limited, much more limited than what you have in Welsh now. So there are some of the problems that were there in 1970 are still there. So that's that aspect. then, I didn't have time to mention, but halfway through the 70s, there was a split within Cymdeithas, and one group established an organisation called Adfer, which had what has become part of a kind of alternation down the years. They put the emphasis on going back to the heartlands. In other words, not so much on status for the language and official status and rights and television and roadside and so on, but strengthening the roots, and a number of very devoted people did do that in their local communities, established different kinds of institution and so on, but they also had a kind of rather dubious philosophic base by which, you know, if you went in the Cymraeg, you weren't a full Welsh person, no, you spoke Welsh, or you were learners of Welsh, had difficulties sometimes. So it was a complex thing, but that is a duality. I've always taken the view, and we're now, I think, in a period again where the emphasis is moving back to if we can't strengthen the strongest communities, what have we got left? But I've always seen it as a kind of dialectic, and looking back at the whole experience of the Channel, of course it's been good it's developed a small industry in Wales, it's developed skills, and it's provided the ability to make films in Welsh and for people to see their own lives in a range of all those things that we hoped for. Of course they've come, but also what struck me very often in that period was how it did people in the wider population, how their attitudes changed. And the fact of that victory at that time, it was the only victory in the time of losses, that really kept a certain flame alive, I think. And also, it provided jobs, you know. Later on, when we were inside Europe, we were able to get monies to train technicians, because the few hours of Welsh, which were earlier on television, were made with Welsh speakers in front of the camera, but all the technicians spoke to you in English, and there was no real esprit de corps. And there was in radio, but not in television. So there were many positive things to do with status, and television, it struck me very often at an anecdotal level how, whereas there were a number of people of Welsh extraction teaching in the English department with me, and they never spoke Welsh to me. I didn't know that they had any Welsh. They came from Cardiff or something like that. They never, I think, listened to Welsh radio, but once the Channel was there, there was an overseeing audience, because on television, it could be sport, it could be something, you can look at things you don't perhaps understand the script. So I think it's you know, news readers are very often, and quite wrongly, I'm sure, young and attractive-looking women, and you know, people think, well, you know, maybe get a job like that. They seem very normal, very sort of. So they're sort of fear of the other is broken down much more by television. So all these things help status. On the international thing, I do remember when S4C had just, I think, come in or was into being, and the Basque and Catalans, Eberl held a conference in Sardinia, which I was present, in which people from these channels were present, and we all thought perhaps there's going to be a lot of cooperation. But so far as I know, I can only think in the early days of S4C, there was one series, and I only remember seeing in which different regions, and of course in the regions in Italy, there was a regional office in Trieste, but it was really part of RAI Trieste, so it wasn't really, I think, a kind of discrete Slovene minority program, but so people came, and from Yugoslavia, which still existed, the various places, they took part in this. And the people who came to Wales were, I think, the Serbian television. And it was really a rather interesting program, I thought, but S4C had to put a notice before they showed it saying, really, we have nothing to do with this. Because it started off crossing the Severn Bridge into Wales in the van with the camera crew, and it sort of said, welcome to Wales and so on, and the narrator sort of said, in Britain the best thing to be is English. If you can't be English, it can sometimes be all right to be Scottish, but really the worst thing to be in Britain is to be Welsh. So S4C, now I don't know if that was why they thought they would steer clear of, but this led to nothing. But one thing it did lead to was that my profile in that period, we ran into in the early 1980s when S4C was being established. We were running into the first days of Eberl, and the first chairman of Eberl was a Welshman, Johan Bonaris, who was the chief executive of Gwynedd in the north of Wales. And in the commission, in the Directorate for Education and Culture, there was a very strategically placed Welshman there, and they were trying to sort of develop minority languages thing, and this eventually led to the Mercator. And the first step in terms of media was that somebody gave my name to the commission. I got this letter sort of saying, you know about media. Couldn't you sort of write us a paper about sort of connecting the European minorities? So I did my best, and I had some connections, particularly in Spain, but in the Spanish state, but not so much elsewhere, but I did my best. And from that was the reason, as author of that, I was invited to the meeting where the Mercator network was established, and the media centre came to Aberystwyth. Elin was one of the first graduate students to come to work with us. This course today, which I'm so pleased to have been part of, is the distant descendant in the empire that has now become part of this organization. Thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Ned. Diolch.